Right, hello everybody, welcome along to part 14 of the David Attenborough readings here. When we left it last, David Attenborough had been doing some recordings of some local people in a very remote village, and a PMman, like the medicine doctor, had been trying to cure the chief of the village, the head man. So when we left it, we weren't sure if it was going to work. Let's see what happens in the next part. The next morning we were visited by a deputation of villagers led by the Pierman, now once again smart and smiling. He stepped upon the bark floor of our hut, which was raised 12 inches above the ground, and sat down. "I come to hear my spirits," he said. The villagers crowded into the hut after him, and he sat down. He wants to hear the recordings they made yesterday of the not the ceremony, but the calling of the spirits to heal the man. Right, here we go. In a circle around the recording machine. There was not room for all who wished to hear this miracle, and an overflow audience stood in a semicircle outside the door. I connected the speaker to the recorder and began playing the tapes. The Pierman was delighted, and as the music of the seance floated out into the sunlight, it was greeted with gasps of approval, nudgings, hushings, and occasional nervous giggles. As each spirit song ended, I stopped the machine and made notes as the Pierman told me the name of each spirit, its appearance and origin, and its capabilities. Some were invested with fearsome powers, others were efficacious with only minor ailments. "Man," said the Pierman in an ecstasy of approval of one song, "that's very powerful, and good for curing a cough." In all, I had recorded 9 of these spirit songs. The last few inches of the tape ran out of the last spool, and I switched off the machine. "Where the rest?" inquired the Pierman peevishly. "I'm afraid this machine humbug bad in the dark," I explained, "and he no able to learn all songs." "But you no get the most powerful ones," the Pierman said, looking petulant at me. "You no get the Awoyoi or the Watabayara, and they fine spirits." I apologized again. The Pierman seemed slightly appeased. "Would you wish to see the spirits?" he asked. "Yes, very much," I replied, "but I thought that no man was allowed to see them, and that they only came down into hut during the night." The Pierman smiled confidentially. "In day," he said, "they have a different shape, and I keep them buried in my hut. Wait, I fetch them." He returned holding in his hand a screwed up piece of paper. He sat down on the bark floor once again and carefully opened the paper. Inside were a number of small polished pebbles. One by one he handed them to me, explaining the identity of each. One was a chip of quartz, another a long stick-like concretion, and another had 4 odd projections on it, which he explained were the arms and legs of the spirit. "I keep them in a secret place in my hut because these very powerful spirits, and if another Pierman get them, then he can use them to kill me. This one," he added gravely, "is a very, very bad one." He handed me a nondescript little pebble. I examined it with care and reverence and passed it on to Charles. Somehow between the two of us we fumbled, and the pebble dropped on the floor and disappeared down a crack between the bark floorboards. Oh God, that's embarrassing, isn't it? "He my most powerful spirit," wailed the Pierman in anguish. "Don't you worry, we'll find him," I said, hastily scrambling to my feet. I threaded my way through the appalled spectators and, lying down, wriggled under the floor of the hut. The ground was very gravelly, and as far as I could see, was covered almost exclusively with pebbles exactly like the incarnate spirit. Charles, kneeling down on the floor above me, stuck a twig through the crack which the precious pebble had disappeared. I looked anxiously at the place beneath, but there seemed to be nothing to choose between any of the pebbles. I selected one at random and passed it up through the crack to Charles, who offered it to the Pierman. "No good!" the Pierman ejaculated icily, throwing it one side with disdain. "Don't worry," I bellowed from beneath the floor. "I'll find him," and passed out 2 other candidates. These met with the same treatment. During the next 10 minutes we proffered several dozen small pebbles. At last he accepted one and grunted grudgingly, "This my spirit." I wriggled back into the sunlight, very dishevelled and covered in dust. The villagers seemed as relieved as we were that the spirit had finally been recovered, and as I sat there I wondered whether we had really returned the correct stone, or whether the Pierman had decided to accept an ordinary pebble, lest the villagers should think that he had lost one of his most powerful weapons and therefore some of his prestige. The Pierman carefully placed the pebble with the others in his screw of paper and walked back to his hut to rebury them. We left the village that afternoon to continue our journey up to the Kukui. We never found out if the headman's health improved. Oh, that's a bit sad, isn't it? We never actually found out whether he got better or not. Now, King George here, remember, he's one of the local natives, but he also works for one of the European men living out there, and he's accompanied David Attenborough and his friend up the river. So when we had first met King George several weeks earlier, we had been misled by his ferocious scowl into thinking that he was ill-tempered and surly, and he had not endeared himself to us by what we took to be his irritating habit of demanding gifts. If Charles took out a packet of cigarettes, King George would hold out his hand and say peremptorily, like preemptive, like just assuming, "Thank you for cigarette," and then accept the gift not as a favour but as a right. This always led to a general distribution of cigarettes, which meant inevitably that we should be short by the end of our trip, for we had budgeted carefully and accurately in order that our loads of stores might be kept to a minimum. However, we realised after a few days that the Amerindians regarded most property as communal. If one man had something that his companions lacked, then it was only right that he should share it. If food was short, then we should split our tin of bully beef with everyone in the canoe, and if we wished it, the Amerindians, as their share of the bargain, would give us some of their cassava bread. As we got to know King George better, we valued him as a charming and kindly companion. He was full of information about the river and knew it intimately. At first, however, we occasionally found it difficult to convey our exact meaning to one another, for though King George spoke a limited amount of pidgin English, his words did not necessarily mean the same thing to all of us. Pidgin, remember, is sort of a bit of a mishmash of English words. An hour to King George was plainly only an indeterminate period of time, for if we asked him how long it would take to walk from the riverbank to a village in the back dam, he nearly always replied, "Hey man, about 1 hour." The unit of an hour was never divided or multiplied, and 1 hour turned out to be 10 minutes on one occasion and 2.5 hours on another. This, of course, was entirely our fault for asking the question, how long, for there was little reason why our units of time should mean anything to King George. It was slightly more satisfactory to inquire, how far? The answer to this varied from, "E no far," which meant probably an hour's journey, to "Man, e far, far away," which meant it would not be possible to reach the place that day. We soon learned, however, that the most accurate way of assessing distance was in points. By a point, King George meant a bend in the river, but to translate 9 points into time required some knowledge of geography, for near its mouth the river was straight for distances of several miles, whereas on the upper headwaters it twisted sharply every few minutes. King George was ever obliging and always endeavoured to do what we wanted, though his willingness sometimes had a slightly unfortunate results. That's leading into something, isn't it? "Do you think we could possibly reach that village tonight?" I once said to him, implying by my tone of voice that I hoped very much that we could. "Well, man," he replied, "I think we must meet it tonight," and he smiled encouragingly. We were still travelling up an uninhabited part of the river at sunset. "King George," I said severely, "where dis village?" "E far, far away." "But you said we meet it tonight." "Well, man, we tried, didn't we?" he said in an injured tone. As we travelled up the Kukui, the river became littered with fallen trees. Some of them we were able to sail round, as they lay only part way across the river. Others were so long that they spanned the banks like a bridge, and these we were able to slide beneath. Sometimes, however, we would come to a giant tree lying almost submerged, which we could not avoid. Then King George would drive at the canoe at it with an open throttle, and at the last moment cut the engine, swing the propeller column up out of the water in case it should foul, and so force the canoe halfway over the obstacle. We then had to climb out, balancing on the slippery log with the current tugging at our feet, haul the boat the rest of the way across, quite literally almost running up at a tree stump that's in the way, letting the boat go over the top halfway, and then getting out and pushing it over the other half. We stopped at small settlements every few miles to ask for animals. There was no place we visited which did not have its complement of tame parrots hopping along the eaves of the huts, or waddling irascibly, it's a new word to me, irascibly round the village with their wings clasped behind their backs. The Amerindians, like us, valued them for their bright colour and their ability to mimic human speech, and often as we arrived the birds would shriek abuse at us in Akawao. Adult parrots are difficult to catch and to tame, so the Akawao take the young chicks from their nest in the forest and rear them by hand. At one village a woman gave us a nestling which she had only just obtained. It was a most appealing little chick with wide brown eyes, an absurdly large beak, and a few scruffy feathers poking their quills through its otherwise naked skin. I could not bring myself to refuse it, but if I were to keep the charming creature, I should have to take lessons on how to feed it. The woman laughingly told me what to do. First I chewed some cassava bread. As it saw me doing so, the little bird came tremendously excited, flapping its stumpy featherless wings and jerking its head up and down in its enthusiasm for the coming meal. I then put my face close to it, whereupon without hesitation it stuck its open beak between my lips. It was now up to me to thrust the chewed cassava bread down its throat with my tongue. Yep, quite literally he is feeding a bird out of his own mouth like a mother bird would do. This seemed a disgustingly unhygienic way of feeding any creature, but the woman assured me that there was no other method of successfully rearing a parrot chick. Fortunately ours was quite old, and a week later it was able to eat soft banana by itself and relieve us of the responsibility of chewing cassava every 3 hours. And why don't we, in fact, end today with a little picture of the parrot. There he is, the one that David Attenborough was feeding. And as you can see, it's sort of just about getting his feathers, in fact, there as well. But I don't know if you can imagine that. I don't know if I could quite imagine trying to chew up bread and then let a parrot come and take it out of my own mouth. Not necessarily the sort of thing we'd all do, eh? Well, thank you very much for joining me for this one, and hope to see you soon for the next reading of David Attenborough. Bye-bye for now.